Sure. My name is Kevin Pugh. I've worked with restorative practices and restorative justice for over 20 years, both in education and in law enforcement, getting hired as the Director of Community Affairs and Director of Restorative Justice. And yet, at the same time, I felt a little bit like a misfit as this career educator. I was a civilian member of the police department. I was not a sworn member. And so I did a lot of work to first connect with the officers and understand their job and make sure that I was creating a restorative justice program that would meet their needs. And I knew that some of the officers in Lafayette had some experiences prior to me coming in with restorative justice, but I spent a lot of time going through a lot of the training with the officers. The chief at the time, Chief Schultz, agreed to let me go through all the training that the officers went through. So after a few years of doing that and also getting nationally certified as a crime prevention specialist, we really started to build a program in the city of Lafayette that was wildly successful and really powerful. We focused initially on juvenile offenders, but then also expanded it to adult offenders. We involved the community, we involved the harm parties as well, and the officers got a voice in that process that was unlike a voice that they could have in court. They really had opportunities to share their perspective in a more personal way. And for the community, that was hugely powerful because they got to understand why police do things the way they do. And they got to understand the impact of their actions on the community and the impact of their actions on the officers who were there to keep our community safe. And so it gave offenders an opportunity to think about their role in the community in a very different way. I remember specifically a case where we had two high school students who were headed to the movies. They brought along a little laser pointer that they were going to mess around with, and they were going to shine it on the screen during the movie or whatever. And one of the friends was trying it out while they were driving through Lafayette. And they were shining it into the car that was driving in front of them. The person in front of them had a post-traumatic stress reaction to this laser because they had a previous experience living in LA where they had been caught in some gang crossfire, and right before their friend was shot and killed next to them in the car, they saw this laser from the sight of the gun, this laser dot bouncing around the inside of their car right before their friend was shot and killed. This person later moved to Lafayette thinking they would come to a smaller, sleepier, safer community, and now here they are driving through Lafayette and they see this laser bouncing around the inside of their car, and they have, as you might imagine, a pretty intense reaction. And the short version of the story is that they dialed 911 from their cell phone and said, "There's a gang member following me with a gun and they're going to kill me. I need help." Officers responded, pulled or identified the car that the call came from, and the car behind them was pulled over as well. And here they had a really scary situation where the person they're trying to protect, out of fear, pulled over right in front of the car that the officers pulled over. And they're yelling instructions to these two teenage girls in the car who supposedly have a gun. And they're yelling at these girls all the instructions, and unfortunately these girls are displaying every furtive movement in the book because they're scared, they're confused. They hear an officer yelling something about a gun, but they don't have a gun, so now they think, does that car in front of us have a gun? Are we in an unsafe position? What should we do? They spill a water bottle, they drop a phone, they start reaching under the seat to pick up the phone, and what does this look like to a police officer? It starts to get pretty intense. And the officer who was on that call used to be an officer in Detroit doing gang patrol, and had never had to shoot anyone in Detroit, and now was here in Lafayette thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to be the day I might have to shoot someone in order to keep others safe? Or am I at risk? And every officer wants to go home to their family, right? And so hesitation can sometimes be really unsafe for an officer, and that's why they're so well trained and they follow their process rather than their emotion of the incident, right? This case ended up getting both the girls out of the car, found that there was no weapon, but what happened qualified as a felony menacing offense by the laws of Lafayette. And so we have these two teenagers who were straight A students in high school, a bright future ahead of them, one of them being recruited for Division I volleyball, and their whole life was about to change with a felony menacing offense on their record. And this case was brought into restorative justice, and the officer had the opportunity to explain to them why this was such a big deal. Because from their perspective and their parents' perspective, this looked like a police power trip. They didn't have a gun, they had a laser pointer. Why did they get roughed up and yanked out of the car and held down on the ground and handcuffed? And why all of this? Because the community typically doesn't understand why police do things the way they do. There's a reason, and it's to keep everyone safe, including the officer. And for that officer to be able to explain in that process what that was like for them, what the steps of their training had them queued up to be doing next if this didn't happen or this didn't happen, the girls got it in a very real way. They were able to understand, like, oh, okay, like, I get it now. I get what harm I caused, not just to the officer, but to the community. Parents were on their lawn with their kids, yanking their kids inside their house, hearing an officer say something about a gun, and now we have residents wondering whether their neighborhood is safe. They canceled their neighborhood barbecue that was supposed to happen 2 weeks later because they didn't know what the neighborhood felt like after that, and it didn't feel like the right time to have everybody out. And anyway, through this process, the girls were able to not only understand, but they were able to do some things to make things better in the community. They met with the members of the neighborhood that were in that area. They met with some of the neighborhood watch folks who were planning this barbecue and helped them to replan it. And in the process, the neighbors got to know these two girls, not as the two girls who gave them a scare, but as two girls who learned a lot about, why you shouldn't mess around with things like that. And then when the officers are giving you instructions, you need to listen to those instructions so that it doesn't escalate into something else, right? And I didn't talk a lot about the victim in that laser pointer case, but the PTSD that triggered for him was big. And so for him to be able to sit in this restorative justice conference and tell his story and explain why he called the police in the first place, that was a big question these two girls and their parents had. Like, why would you call the police because of a laser pointer? Well, they heard his story and now they get it. And now they're able to have a lot more empathy and understanding for what the impact was on him. And if I remember correctly, this person was a teacher in a Lafayette school. And the impact from this incident was so big that he felt unsafe getting in his car and driving anywhere. And so he couldn't drive himself to work, couldn't drive himself to the grocery store, couldn't take care of himself the way he needed to because of the fear this brought back for him.
Because he thought he was safe.
He thought he was safe here.
He then
Yeah.
said,
And so the girls, they heard that, and they offered to do things for him, like drive him to work, or drive him to the grocery store, or do the grocery shopping for him, and drive him to therapy. And he got hooked up with some therapy again and started working on the PTSD. And so instead of him hiding out in his house in fear, he was able to be part of this process where he could hear what the incident really was. He could get offers from these girls to make things right for him. And he was able to still be a productive member of the Lafayette community because he was able to get his needs met as well, instead of becoming a recluse in his house out of fear and maybe becoming another kind of need for the city of Lafayette to support, right? So this was one example of a case that was really powerful, and we used that case for training with officers and with community members. But in the first 3 years of taking cases in the city of Lafayette, we had about 300 offenders go through restorative justice, and only one reoffended. That's a huge difference from what is generally around 80% as the national average. 80% of first-time offenders will generally reoffend. If you get that down to 1%, you're making a huge impact in the city. And this program did. Over the first 3 to 5 years, the measurable impact was that it dropped the overall crime rate, juvenile and adult, in the city of Lafayette by 17%, which is a pretty big chunk.
Wow.
And the lieutenant governor at the time, Jane Norton, recognized the Lafayette Police Department with the Pioneer Policing Award because of that, because it was an innovative way to have a huge impact in the city.
You can see how it moves it from a very individual adversarial system to the community, finding a way to strengthen not only each other, but bring people back into the community.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because then you have someone who caused some harm in the community, the offender, and I don't typically like using the terms offender and victim, but in terms of the process, that's the role they play, right? So you have an offender that avoids taking up the resources of the court system over and over and over again as they reoffend, which is typically what happens, especially at that time. Lafayette was a home rule city. There was limited sentencing ability from our municipal courts. So they would see the same offenders in court over and over and over again. But when we have a system like this that stops that pipeline, now we're talking about impacting the financial resources of the city in a very different way, as well as the human resources of the city in a different way. And officers, as they started using this more and more, would tell me that they would show up differently to work, and they felt like they could interact differently with the community, especially the more the community understood their role. And one of the things those two girls from that laser pointer case also did as part of their agreement was they went on ride-alongs with officers to really get a better understanding of why do officers do things the way they do, and what is their job. And they're not just out there looking for bad guys all the time. They're out there looking to help our community and keep our community safe. So having that mindset was powerful, a powerful tool to drop the crime rate in the city of Lafayette. We were also able to build a robust program of volunteers where we had citizens of Lafayette get trained in restorative justice facilitation, and they had an active role in dropping the crime rate in Lafayette and in strengthening the community by repairing harm when it did occur. I'd love to see that happen again in Lafayette.